This happened about 4 years ago. I was 22 at that time. I had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Denver. It wasn't the best place, but it was the only thing I could afford. It was an older complex, had thin walls, and sometimes I could hear my upstairs neighbor arguing with his girlfriend late at night. I had no job back then, but after searching for places, I found a hardware store that needed a shelf stocker. So I started working there. I used to go straight home after my shift. I liked home-cooked meals. But one night, I was late, so I decided to stop by the nearby diner to grab something to eat. It was around 11 p.m. The place was mostly empty, except for a couple of truckers sitting at the counter. I took my food to go and got back in my car. It was an old Fiesta I bought recently. I was ready to head home, but that's when I noticed something. An old black sedan parked across the lot, facing my car. The headlights were off, but I could guess from the shadow that someone was sitting in the driver's seat. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just another late-night customer or someone waiting for a friend. I pulled out of the parking lot and started driving home. But when I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw the sedan pull out right after me. At this point, I still wasn't too concerned. It wasn't unusual for someone to take the same route as me. There weren't a lot of roads leading out of that area, but the longer I drove, the more uneasy I started to feel. Every turn I made, the car made, every stoplight, it stayed just a few car lengths behind me. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But then, just to be sure, I decided to test something. I took an unnecessary right turn onto a quiet side street, and the sedan followed. My hands started sweating. I started driving fast. I was panicking. This wasn't normal. I decided to drive straight home. I was thinking maybe the bright parking lot of my apartment would scare off whoever was riding the car. So as I pulled in, I expected the car to pass by, but it didn't. It pulled into the lot and parked a few spaces down. At this point, I wasn't about to just get out of my car. I sat there for a moment, pretending to check my phone, hoping the driver would go inside a unit, proving me that they actually lived there. But they didn't. The car just sat there idling. I didn't want to lead them to my actual place, so I made a quick decision. I backed out and left the complex again. I figured if they followed me, that would confirm my worst fears. And sure enough, the moment I pulled onto the street, the sedan followed. I had no idea who this person was or what they wanted. I didn't want to drive to the police station because I didn't even know if I was overreacting. But I knew I couldn't go home. I made another random turn onto a larger road. But even I was shocked. For the first time, I saw an opportunity. There was a gas station, still open, with people inside. I slammed on the gas and pulled into the station as fast as I could. But the sedan drove past. I sat there trying to calm down. Maybe I was safe now. Maybe they'd given up. After a few minutes, I cautiously pulled out of the gas station and started driving home again. I kept checking my mirrors, but the car was nowhere in sight. When I finally got back to my apartment, I sat there for a minute. I was watching the lot, making sure the sedan wasn't lurking nearby. But nothing. I got out of my car, hurried inside, locked my door, and sat in my dark apartment for what felt like hours, waiting. I barely slept that night. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted. I kept thinking what would have happened if I hadn't gone to the gas station. It was late November when I decided to visit my uncle's cabin deep in the woods of Montana. He had passed away a year prior. Thus, my dad asked me to check on the place since no one had been there in months. I figured I would make a weekend out of it. I was planning on doing some fishing and enjoying the quiet. The drive was long, nearly 5 hours from my place, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The place looked exactly as I remembered. It was small and weathered, but it was still solid. The trees surrounding it stood tall and thick. their branches swaying slightly in the cold wind. It felt strange seeing it so dark and untouched. My uncle had spent so much time here. He was always working on something, keeping it in good shape. Now it just looked abandoned. I parked my truck and grabbed my bag from the passenger seat. The air was crisp, the kind that bites at your skin. As I walked up the porch steps, they creaked under my weight. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I immediately felt that familiar mix of comfort and eeriness when I used to visit him. As I said, it was abandoned for a year, thus a thin layer of dust covered everything. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Then I went outside to find out the reason. On the west side of the house, a small branch had fallen over and broke the cable. I sighed, but then I remembered that my uncle used to have an emergency generator. With nobody there, it took me half an hour to start the engine. After that, I lit the fireplace, using some of the old firewood stacked near it. The flames caught quickly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. While I was setting my bag down, I heard a sizzling sound and then everything was dark. I was frustrated. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped back outside to the shed where the generator was stored. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees. The quiet was giving me chills. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Being out in the woods alone will do that to anyone. I got the generator running. Then I went back inside. After switching on the lights, the cabin felt a little less creepy. I heated up a can of soup, sat at the small wooden table, and just listened to the crackling of the fire. But that's when I noticed something. The door to the cabin wasn't fully closed, and I was sure I had shut it when I arrived, to ease the tension. I thought to myself that maybe the wind had pushed it open, or maybe I hadn't latched it properly. I walked over, shut it firmly, but this time I locked it properly. Then the rest of the night was quiet. I sat by the fire. I started scrolling through my phone, trying to get some signal. Not that I expected any out here. Eventually, I started feeling tired. I turned off the lights, crawled into the old bed in the corner, and fell asleep. I suddenly woke up at midnight, but I didn't know what woke me. 1 second, I was out cold, but the next, I was wide awake. I stayed on the bed, listening to the surroundings. But it was silent. Too silent, in fact. I am sure anyone who has spent time in the woods knows that the forest is never completely quiet. There's always something. The rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant chirping of crickets. But right now, I heard nothing. I slowly reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the window. There were flurries of snow here and there. But then I saw something. There were footprints. They were not mine. They were new. Like something or someone had just been there. They led from the woods to the front door of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the flashlight, tried to process it. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were near me. I forced myself to move. Slipping out of bed as quietly as I could, I reached for my uncle's old hunting rifle above the fireplace. My hands were shaking as I quietly checked the chamber. After slowly loading the rifle, I stood there silently, staring at the door, trying to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. I didn't hear anything. I took a slow step forward, pressing my ear against the wood, but still nothing. I turned to check the window again, but then I saw another pair of footprints. They weren't leading to the cabin. They were leading away. My stomach dropped. Someone had been inside. I gripped the rifle tighter, scanning the dark corners of the room. The mere idea of being watched by someone while I was sleeping creeped me out. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. I knew every inch of this cabin, so if someone was hiding, I'd find them. I moved cautiously, checking behind the couch, under the bed, inside the tiny bathroom. But everything was empty. I lost my mind. I kept telling myself that maybe I had forgotten to lock the door earlier. Maybe the wind had blown it open and some animal had wandered in. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I would have heard someone open that door. I checked my phone again. No service. I needed to get out of there. But it was safer for me to stay here than to go outside. I sat quietly on the bed holding the rifle at one hand. I drank the beer to ease my mind. That night was the longest I have ever been awake. I quietly took my stuff and left the place in the morning. I still don't know who or what was inside the cabin that night, and I would never be able to forget it for the rest of my life. It was August 2007. I was only 10 at that point. My mom used to work late shifts at the nearby hospital. My dad left us when I was just a little baby, so she had to take care of me. I was used to her coming late from work. It wasn't a big deal for me. Our neighborhood was mostly quiet. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids rode their bikes until dark. My mom always reminded me not to talk to strangers while she was out, and not to open the door for anyone either. I always listened to her, but that night I was grateful that I had listened to her, because it was something that I still can't shake. It was Wednesday. I remember because I had just finished my homework. I was sitting in front of the TV, flipping through channels, trying to find something decent to watch. The house was quiet except for the sound of the show Squirrel Boy playing on the TV. But then I heard a knock at the front door. It wasn't loud or urgent, just a soft, steady tapping. My first thought was that it might be our neighbor, Mrs. Larson. Sometimes she used to drop off extra food if she made too much. But when I peeked through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch. He was wearing a gray hoodie, the hood pulled up just enough to cover most of his face. I could see his mouth though. Thin lips, slightly parted like he was whispering something to himself. I was nervous. We never had visitors this late. At first I didn't open the door, but then he knocked again, a little louder this time. "Hey, kid," he said calmly. His voice was almost friendly, but something about it put me on edge. "I'm looking for my dog. Have you seen a little brown terrier running around?" I didn't answer at first. I just stood there gripping the doorknob. Then I nervously replied, "No, sir, I didn't." He sighed and then asked me again, "Are you sure, kid? He's really small, probably scared. Maybe you could come outside and help me look." I thought to myself that maybe he was not lying, but something in my gut told me to stay quiet. I wasn't stupid. I knew what my mom always said about strangers, and yet there was a part of me that almost felt guilty. What if he was telling the truth? What if his dog really was lost? "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he took a step closer. "Come on, kid," he said, his tone shifting slightly in a creepy way. Just for a second, I felt my throat tighten. Something was wrong. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to call my mom. But then, without any warning, the doorknob started turning. I forgot that I hadn't locked it. My heart stopped as I lunged forward. I slammed the deadbolt into place just as he shoved against the door. The sound of it clicking into place was the only thing that kept him out. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing on the other side. Then he muttered something under his breath, something I couldn't quite hear. I stumbled back, my legs shaking as I started slamming the dialer to call my mom. But before I could even dial, a new sound filled the room. Scratching. He was trying to pick the lock. The metallic clicking sent a jolt of panic through me. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing. What was I supposed to do? Call 911? Run? Hide? Without thinking, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. My fingers clenched around the handle so tight they ached. I crouched behind the counter, my entire body locked in place, waiting. But the scratching had stopped. For a few seconds there was nothing, just silence. I thought he had left because he could not open the door. But I was wrong. I heard the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the house. It was him. He was checking the windows. I held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut, like that would somehow make me invisible. I tried to remember if I had locked all the windows. I was pretty sure I had. But what if I missed one? The footsteps stopped. Then an hour passed. I stayed there, hidden, the knife still in my hand. I was terrified to even move. The only thing keeping me from completely breaking down was the thought that my mom would be home soon. She'd know what to do. She'd make this all go away. But she was late. 3 hours had passed. I stayed at the same place for what felt like forever. When my mom finally walked in at nearly 2 a.m., I grabbed onto her tightly. I told her everything. At first, she didn't believe me, but then she inspected the door and found the deep scratches around the lock. Without wasting any time, she called 911. The police came after 10 minutes. They took a report about everything I had told them, but they didn't find anything but the scratches. There wasn't much they could do. There were no cameras in the house, no fingerprints or any type of real evidence. Just my word and the marks he left behind.